Okay, so we'll do a little panel. Feel free to shoot questions after I ask them a bunch of preset kind of questions that I have in mind. So the first one is, do you personally care about humanity's prospect of branching the beauty and opportunity of, let's call it, conscious life to another planet? Why or why not? I guess we can go around. Sure.
I think it's pretty obvious. I actually care quite a bit, and I think it's quite clear that the deeper you get into the research of what's possible on Mars, also somehow the better you understand what it was that happened on our own planet, because somehow, again, the first billion years it existed, it was a bit like Mars. It also was just kind of regolith, or like sand and sunshine and some geothermal stuff, but there was no plants and there was no atmosphere except some thick carbon dioxide and stuff. So this is where sort of the complexity of life changes things to the better. And that's basically what happened on Earth with the rainforest, and suddenly there was an ecosystem with animals, and suddenly some of them were smart enough to become people and make music and have conversations and write books. And I think that if you're in that kind of line of thought, it is kind of beautiful to get to another planet and experience that and sort of kickstart the infusions of knowledge and information into this kind of depth, sort of amount of chemicals that is currently there.
Yeah, so I'd agree. I guess for me, it's just the thing that life has to do, which is pursue new goals and expand. I think as Andreas mentioned earlier, I kind of see the progression is moving to the new world, and then conquering new goals, and then it was Antarctica, and then it was Everest, and then it was the moon, and we need new goals to move onwards, and I think Mars is kind of like the next step. So I think it's important for humanity just as a whole.
Cheers. Thank you. Have you guys heard of the yeast jar analogy? Do you know the yeast jar analogy? No. So the population of yeast lasts 30 days, and it's 50% of the population is on day 29. And then by day 30, it dies based on its own putrid creations. The problem with any life is ultimately it poisons its ecosystem, which is what we're doing now. And this is the problem of any closed system, any zero-sum system. And the great thing about the time we're living in, or perhaps the sort of dialectic or great tragedy, is we have now the capacity to have a non-zero-sum system by using the whole solar system. So I do feel like our ascendance to become an orbital civilization seems to be happening, at day 29 in terms of the carrying capacity of our planet. And I think everybody will know that our civilization uses approximately 5 planets. The growing middle class, fantastic that billions of people are coming out of poverty, but the cost of that environmentally is huge. And so in a way we have no choice but to start figuring out how to use the energy of the solar system, of the sun, the resources and water of the solar system. It's not a philosophical thing for me, it's sheer pragmatism. It's economics, it's exponential growth. We are up against these inevitabilities. So I think that's why space matters. Another thing, I'm sorry, hogging the microphone on my soapbox. When you start thinking about systems and you start thinking about the value of a space program, NASA has one economist. He once told me that for every dollar the US government had spent on space, it had been worth $14 to America as a technological civilization. So the capacity to do this great thing bootstrapped everything from materials. If you hold your phone up, the CCD device here is from JPL. the microprocessor, I guess, started its life being shrunk down from the room size to fit in a box about this big for the Gemini and Apollo missions. The programming and software, Unix, the error-resistant code, had to not fail 180,000 miles from Earth. And so we didn't have error or bug-free programming until Apollo. And of course, once bankers realized that you could have bug-free software, they went, hey, well, let's do banking and air traffic control, and this explosion of software which has followed these innovations. And so I think there's a not well enough articulated relationship between a grand challenge and the ability of a grand challenge to galvanize the best in us, to create value economically, but also in capacity. And I think we need to do it. I think it's an imperative for the reasons that I just said, because we are up against this zero-sum problem where our planet isn't big enough for us. And with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Tony Sefton. I work with Julia in ESA Business Applications. I think most of it's already been said at various points this evening. The only extra point I would make is, I think one thing that really excites people, that really gets them interested in science and engineering, are the sorts of missions we've seen a good example of this evening. I was inspired by the Apollo landings in the early 70s. It's really good to see so many young people here this evening. That's really fantastic. I hope a lot of you are already thinking about careers in the space industry. And in the UK, you're very lucky. This is a fantastic time in the UK for the space industry. It's one of the few industries that I think has a growth of something like 8% a year for the last dozen years or so, even through the recession. There are some huge forecasts for both the upstream and downstream, so I really encourage you to stick at it. So yeah, I think science missions, missions to some of the planets are fantastic from an inspirational point of view. So yeah, I'll leave it like that. Thanks.
Can I just make one point? I just want to expand a bit on the point that I was making in the end of the slideshow, that I think another reason it's important is that you discover that if you really try hard to engineer a kind of small civilization in a place that has no fossil fuels and has only carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, then you figure out ways to make that into a good thing, and I think it will teach you in any case to sort of engineer your civilization in a more responsible way on Earth. So I think it will have that as a really, really positive byproduct. To learn how to colonize Mars, you need to colonize Earth in a much more responsible way first, and somehow you can almost see the entire sustainability movement as having the byproduct of making it possible to suddenly colonize Mars, because it wasn't possible before we had wind power and before we had solar panels. It was simply there was no outlook for colonizing Mars in any way. Maybe with nuclear, but that has limited time span. So I think there's an interesting link to the whole idea of living in a responsible way on our own planet to colonize Mars.
Cool. Thanks for that. What about non-STEM people? So it's pretty obvious how to involve engineering and scientists and so on, engineering people and scientists, but how do you involve non-STEM people? So science, technology, engineering, and medicine. So how do you involve non-STEM?
Yeah.
How do you involve the artists and the creative types and the...
I think, as mentioned, I think that's actually the more important bit. Like I said, being an engineer, your dream is to put stuff on Mars, but just getting the budgets and the will, as James mentioned, to go and do that, I think that happens from a culture perspective. That happens from the stories we tell ourselves. And someone goes to Mars and their mother says, "Do I pack your lunch?" versus like, that's crazy. like those are the things that, you know, now people come to me for funding and they're like, I'm gonna put satellites in orbit. I was like, okay, what kind of satellites, right? And it's not, you know, they're 20 years old, and that's just a normal kind of everyday conversation, and that doesn't happen without people, you know, just going and making that a normal thing. So, and you know, I looked on Kickstarter. There's not a lot of Mars stuff, so there's a real niche here. So not only is it important, but there's a good business opportunity for, I think, the non-STEM community to go and do this, which will have dividends down the road. James?
I have a terrible feeling it should be just STEM people.
Any questions?
Might be biased.
Feel free to jump in.
So I study medicine, and I'm Philip, by the way. So I wanted to ask, from the human perspective, what are the biggest barriers to getting someone on Mars?
You want to take that one?
Oh,
You're speaking of just the STEM people.
From a biological perspective, for the long term, you know, even if it's a couple of years, absence of gravity, and we know from the twin study that even a year without gravity is hugely detrimental. The perchlorates problem I mentioned, this, you know, essentially like asbestos, as carcinogenic as asbestos in the Martian soil. It's a huge problem. And the lunar soil isn't much better. It's if you look at Earth dirt under a microscope, it's softened by billions of years of being bashed around. Lunar dust is sharp, and so a lot of the astronauts came back with little coughs because essentially the lunar soil had ripped up their lungs. So there are lots of micro problems, although absence of gravity perhaps isn't a micro problem. And then, you know, I think a lot of the things that people worry about is just the human stuff. Like, how do you make sure a team can survive for that length of time without, you know, getting a patty with each other? But I think if I was to put them in order, I think the would be gravity. I think solar radiation, certainly the potential of a coronal mass event or a very large solar flare that would irradiate the space travelers. The sun is constantly flaring. In fact, the Apollo missions just got lucky. And we don't really talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that because of this political will and this sort of calendar they had, they sort of drove on and they ignored some of the really big risks. But if you look at those missions from Apollo 8 to Apollo 17, I think there are about 3 instances where it was pretty close. And of course, Apollo 13 is the one we know about, but there are other problems where, you know, there could have been a fatality. The space shuttle had a 2% failure rate. Like, space is hard. This is why we have this phrase in the community. And so I think, God, I'm sounding like a super downer now. Perhaps I should give it a,
No, I think some of the human problems are actually the bigger ones. I don't know if the Russian experiment, there was a bunch of volunteers who kind of put themselves in containment for 6 months or whatever it was, and basically they couldn't coexist. They had to close the experiment. Same with like the biosphere experiment, too, where like people come in and broke them out essentially outside. You go and read the experiments. Like, it's really hard to just put a small group of people in an enclosed space and feed them and clothe them and just have them. Just imagine living with your roommates or whatever. Like, you didn't do the dishes. After 6 months, that becomes a killing event essentially. so that and I think those are the things that still need to be developed, and that's the lunar gateway and so on. We'll figure those things out.
There's another one. This is the stuff of nightmares. Didn't you hear this one? So there's a resistant bacteria to antibiotics in the toilets of the ISS. And this has evolved hugely rapidly. And fortunately, it hasn't, it's, where human beings are still immune to this bacteria. But the chance of that bacteria passing on that capacity to be antibiotic resistance to something which does affect us, like a cold, that's the stuff of nightmares. So I think this is why, I don't want to be such a downer, but this is why it's hard. I think it makes sense that it will send astronauts on scientific adventures where there's a great scientific remit. But I think NASA's got it right. We need to solve these problems by getting the community to come together. We're over the era of just one agency trying to do it and showing that this is a sort of political victory. When we go, we want everybody to go.
It's okay.
Sorry. Yeah, I think actually, another answer to that question could be, I think I agree a lot with you, that what you need is, you need it to be attractive to go there. And I think, because I don't think people mind a bit of risk on the travel, and I think it will probably come down in cost enough that enough people can participate, but I think it needs to be incredibly attractive. And it will automatically be when, let's say, 5,000 people live there or 10,000. But in order to get the first ones to live there, the type of habitats need to be attractive. And I don't think it's enough to fly spaceships there and then live inside a tin can. So that's why one of our strategies in this kind of settlement design would be to try to create spaces that allow you to walk around in some form of outdoor environment. By far the biggest challenge is the pressure, because you don't want to walk around in a diving suit, or in a pressure suit. So to create some form of pressurized environments that still allows you to experience daylight and allows you to experience a sandstorm and the sunset and the sunrise every day, then you can actually live a fairly simple life. I mean, people live like that in villages all over the world. They live in maybe 1 kilometer radius, and they drink coffee every morning and eat a meal and read the paper and have a good life. And sort of maybe they run a small business and make pizza. So and I think that would be enough if sort of the environment was attractive enough and that doesn't work if you have to live inside a tin can. So that would be our sort of.
Makes sense. Any more questions? Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for your talks earlier. Maybe it was the images of the ships or the comparisons to previous exploration epochs, but you made me think about our perhaps last most famous exploration period, to the Americas, and how first we got inspiration, then we got minerals, then we got land, and eventually innovation. Do you see that order being very different in our exploration of Mars, or do you see other things coming out as major exports across the centuries?
Who wants to take this?
I've got an opinion. I think you're talking about the transition that kind of happens from, along the exploration pathway, or I don't know what the words are, but for us in the venture capital sort of community, it's kind of like how the business model changes, okay? And I think, initially, what you're describing is the thing that's kind of seems to be the model that people have followed through the centuries, in that it's just kind of a romantic thing to do. It's an entertainment value. Yeah, we go and do that. People make money off that. And then you get more people there, and you got kind of like a bridgehead, and then it evolves from there into other things. And I think it's tricky because you're predicting, 20, 30 years at least into the future. That's a really long time to make like any kind of time span. Who knows? You can make up, maybe going for monopole hydrogen or some like crazy thing we don't even know yet, right? So you just don't know. But I think from what has been mentioned here tonight, you go there, things will be found, like people find a use for it, and you don't know what that is until you kind of go there.
Yeah, I imagine the first phase will be similar to, for instance, what's going on in the Antarctic at the moment. You can see it primarily being science exploration, partly manned, but also, of course, a lot of unmanned satellites and rovers and other types of exploration. But I guess if we're talking 30, 40 years from now, once it's been found that there are profitable minerals and other resources on some of the outer planets or the moon, then there will be undoubtedly a big drive towards the commercial exploitation side. So I would like to think that the exploitation will be done in some sort of environmentally clean way. But that's for all of us, I guess, to decide as time goes by.
Any other questions? Right, last question.
What does an environmentally clean way mean in terms of Mars? Because we're thinking maybe there's life there. Are we going to ruin that? What does it even mean?
What do you mean by ruin that?
So if we, obviously NASA has a policy of making sure that we don't contaminate anything that we go out and explore. There's a risk that if there's life on Mars, we could contaminate it. What parts of Mars would we potentially want to preserve? What does it mean to be environmentally conscious in terms of Mars?
Let's take it.
Yeah, no, I think you probably have a better answer. I think it's a good question. I think you probably need to make some form of natural parks and protect bacteria or very, very simple life forms in the way you do on Earth with more complex life.
Yeah, the planetary protection debate is unresolved, and there's a dynamic tension between, if you like, the engineering community that want to make cool stuff, and the science community which are like, wait a second, we want to know that this result isn't something, it isn't us, isn't something we brought along. And one of the debates about what Viking saw, because there was signals that I can't remember if they were amino acids or what, but certainly suggestive that there was something which potentially could be the ingredients of life, but they just didn't know whether it was, from the spacecraft. And so I think again, this is why it's so difficult to do this stuff. The chances are that because of the perchlorites and because of the radiation environment, anything in the top meter will be irradiated. And so the current thinking is that life will be either a meter down in the tundra or in caves. And so I think perhaps we'll be able to land and walk around, and it's like providing we are careful. But certainly I think if people turned up with mining equipment and didn't take precautions, the scientific community would be like, hey, wait a second, there's something making methane here. We need to figure out what it is first.
Who's going to govern that?
Elon Musk.
Well, there are space treaties now. I imagine there'll be a treaty which will be formed. There's existing, I think, legal frameworks for doing that. But, I mean, we don't know.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, no. I just believe that I love Sabrine's comments about the governance of Mars, because it's likely to be governed out of mutual interest. Like, it's probably in all the people that are on Mars' interest to protect those bacteria. Otherwise, they will keep finding bacteria and they don't know what it is, or so it's probably going to be found out by the people who are there, and there will be new models we don't even know about yet.
But it's a bit hard to explore on the ground without contaminating, right?
I think the risk is reduced, as James mentioned.
What's that?
The risk is reduced, as James mentioned. But I mean, that's the nature of, you go anywhere and you don't know until you go there and you have the capacity to do something, and then, maybe you cause some damage, maybe you haven't.
Follow up would be, is that something that we should be worried about?
Yeah.
Sure.
Have you not seen the movie Life?
All right. right, last question. You want to? Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. First of all, can I thank you for putting together such an amazing lineup of speakers tonight? And I'm just thinking about, like, I have a 5-year-old daughter, and I'm a governor of a primary school, and I've come to this event, and my eyes have been opened to the fact that there really is a space industry. There's venture capital. There are people. There is the potential for us to innovate and be entrepreneurs in this space. But if you went to a primary school in St Albans, you would be a very, very long way from connecting with any of this. And if you read the Daily Mail every day or watch the BBC, you have no idea about any of this stuff. So how can we connect what you're talking about, which is really, our civilization being on the brink of a space future, with our children who are kind of trapped in a kind of regressive educational system and a mainstream media that doesn't really, is so focused on, Brexit or whatever, negative stories, doesn't really engage with the exciting space that you guys are suggesting the world is. Is there what can we do? I mean, I went to the Science Museum with my daughter, and I was just like, what a waste of time. It's like none of this stuff is there, really. How do we connect? Do you feel the disconnect between the space you're working in and the reality that most of the population is being mediated?
Are microphones working?
Oh, yeah. I know NASA, this vexes them. Because, what they do is amazing, like really incredible. And, but one of the things which they were really surprised by, and it was not planned, is suddenly all these millennials wearing NASA meatballs.
Yeah.
And, they don't really track this stuff. And but I had a friend of mine who worked at a American brand company. He's like, "Hey James, what's the deal with everyone wearing meatballs?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" And apparently their trend studies were saying that kids think the space is cool. And I think one of the things which has happened is that in a world or in a universe or solar system where everything has no clothes, the brands are being eroded every left, right, and centre. There are a handful of brands which still stand for something, and I think NASA and ESA are certainly in that category. And they provide like a sort of lightning rod for inspiration about being better than ourselves. And I think one of the reasons why NASA and I think ESA they're just not natural storytellers. I don't think there's certainly not budget for that. There's not, they're a little, it's a fraction, but it's not. And JPL is very good at it because they've got Hollywood down the road, and they're like, hey, we need to film 7 minutes of terror. Can you make? But I think certainly that is a role for perhaps content makers to say, listen, here's this amazing era we're about to go into. Let's start making stories and create the sort of cultural environment that allowed Apollo to happen. And if you like, Apollo, the moonshots, that was a cultural achievement as much as an engineering achievement.
So I guess from a few things. Teaching is hard. Teaching is hard. I still think I'm, phenomenally blessed to have been taught by really good people. And I think that's the really hard part, right? How do you tell that story? And I think for the other thing is there's people in the audience that might be able to help you with that problem. I'm hearing my venture capital hat on. This is a customer with a problem who this is an unfilled need. So there's that. And I think the other thing is just persistence. Just keep exposing them to interesting things, and it's just hard, and being able to tell the story and communicate it to a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, they grow up really, really fast, and being able to do that. But I think there's lots of people that can help you with that. Who outreach to ESA. I think there's people within the room that can help you with that problem.
maybe I can also just say a little bit again about our program, the one that Julia was describing in her presentation. So, I mean, our strapline is Space for Everyday Life. And as you might have gathered from one of Julia's slides, I mean, we've supported something like 300 different projects in the last 9 or 10 years. And that includes the whole gamut of things that even a 5-year-old could benefit from. So, for instance, we've done education in Africa through satellite communications. We've had projects that have benefited from technologies previously developed for the International Space Station to provide support for things like telemedicine type of applications. So food, support to wine growers, to food production companies. I mean, there's really no limit. Space has no limit is another of our straplines. There almost is no limit, and these days people are using space without even knowing it. So for GPS through the European equivalent, the Galileo system. I mean, this is what almost I could make an appeal to you for the creative ones amongst you with ideas for how to come up with ideas for new types of services to help us all. I mean, we have funding support through our program, so please come and talk to us. Hopefully you made notes of our URL, but please come and talk to myself or Julia afterwards if you're interested in developing ideas that we can help support. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, last question. What's your favorite space movie, book, or person? I guess in order.
I mean, to me, still has to be 2001: Space Odyssey because of this strange object, which is this double square rectangle, and I think it's probably the closest you come to a narrative that could be about what Ray Kurzweil calls the singularity, which this idea that knowledge one day will spread into the universe, and somehow everything will materialize in knowledge and computing, and it will be a beautiful thing. And at least that's how I see that object floating out in space. So for me, that has to be that.
Movie? So,
movie, book,
and then book and person.
I mean, whatever you want.
Oh, okay.
One or all.
Do you want to do the other two, or?
No, like the book, it has it's definitely Robert Sobrine's The Case for Mars. If you have not read it and you're interested in Mars, it's an incredibly plausible and very thorough explanation of why it has to be done and how it can be done.
It's a good book.
It's a very sort of it's definitely the best strategy for Mars out there. That's by far.
Okay, so for me, I guess my favorite movie, it's very watchable, I think it's John Carter. I think I was the only guy in the theater watching John Carter when it came out. So it was a great experience. And I think it's just because it kind of harkens back to when science fiction was kind of illuminating and hopeful, which I think it was captured quite well in the movie, and it's just interesting to watch. I think in terms of a book, I still like Rocket Ship Galileo by Robert Heinlein. Still made like a big impact on me when I was 10 and I read it. And I think, that really brought home to me that, there was a bunch of kids who basically built a moon rocket. And I guess it brought home to me that I could do something like that. And in terms of people, I kind of go between three. So Michael Collins, who is the guy who was behind in the command module, who back to what James said, like not knowing whether like Buzz Aldrin or Neil Armstrong would come back from the moon, and he would be the guy who'd go home, and so he was the one who survived, right? In the worst scenario, which was like 50% or something, and he wasn't worried about being alone, but he's worried about he was going to go back, and he was the one survived if the other two died. And then I guess Yuri Gagarin, who's the first man in space. You know, he was the first man, but I think he became this icon that really couldn't lead a normal life afterwards, which I think is sort of a sad thing. And I think the third one is just an entrepreneur I've met. And he told me this story about, you know, he's got a space company that he wanted me to fund. And he basically failed out of astronaut selection. And he was like, oh, I'm going to make a company, I'm going to get there. So I got a lot of respect for him too.
Awesome. So I love the pale blue dot on YouTube. Have you seen that? It's Carl Sagan's description of our planet, and every time we run our AI program, we start with that just to get the tears going. Got a little bit of Mars dust in my and I think that's the sort of touchstone for me. I think, you know, Carl Sagan nails a lot of kind of what it is to be a space philosopher. And this movie, the movie I go back to, the sort of secret one I watch when my wife's not looking, is Contact. And I love this movie so much, and I love this kind of concept that she's grappling with, you know, this question, how did you do it? Which is the L variable in the Drake equation, if you know that equation, which is how did you become a technological civilization and survive? And this, you know, concept is pretty out there. Concept is they managed to hang a Hollywood movie around, which is pretty awesome. But that's my secret, you know, one on planes when no one's watching. And yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's a good one.
Yeah, well, for me, somebody's already mentioned my favourite film, 2001: Space Odyssey, because I think it was so far ahead of its time. In terms of a book, maybe partly to do with my quirky sense of humour, but Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you haven't, any of you who haven't read it, then I definitely encourage you to do so. And yeah, for the most inspirational person, I think it is hard to go beyond the astronauts. So obviously Tim Peake from the UK, Chris Hadfield from Canada. So yeah, as I said a bit earlier, I encourage you, all of you, to take inspiration from what's the sort of things that have been presented today, but also by the other great adventures in space that have happened over the last 50 years or so. So I wish you all the very best with your futures.
Okay, so thank you very much to everyone. Thanks for coming.